Hello, Player One. Welcome to the Gaming History Club. My name is Gabby.
Hello, and I'm JP. First person shooters, better known as FPS, are kind of like blockbuster action movies. They are hugely popular, massively successful, explosive eye candy, and in all likelihood, if you haven't played them, you still definitely heard of them. In fact, they can be seen as the flagship genre of video games. So let's uncover the messy history of FPS.
So, JP, what's the first thing you think about when you hear the word FPS?
I definitely get nostalgic about my days playing Counter-Strike Source back in the day, and also hearing them sounds like headshot,
Yeah,
double kill. Even though I think that was from Unreal, but whenever I played Counter-Strike, they had that in anyway, like with mods and stuff, right? So yeah.
yeah. The funny thing is that kind of like the same sound they make in Dota kind of game.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you don't really play, do you? But yeah,
No.
that's quite funny.
What
But yeah,
about you?
me,
Yeah.
I don't know why the first thing pop in my mind is actually um frames per second instead of like first person shooter or frames per second, which is Jake Baldino's from Game Ranks' podcast, basically.
I know, yeah.
Not the game instead. But anyway, if we're talking about first person shooter, definitely getting nostalgic over those LAN parties during high school in the computer lab
What did you
class.
play FPS like LAN party wise? Did you ever like?
Yeah, it's so basically back in high school, we have like a computer room for
Mm,
our computer class, and the teacher was so nice that he was gonna let us to play if we're done with our task of the day kind of deal. So yeah, people were just gonna try to do everything as fast as they could so that afterwards they can play Counter Strike. But yeah, it was really fun. I mean, I was really bad at it, and I'm still bad at, shooter games. But anyway,
For me, it was really similar, but we didn't like our teacher wasn't just nice and let us get on with whatever once we've done our work. We just, whenever he left the room, and he would leave the room for like half an hour at a time, we'd play Medal of Honor.
right, okay.
Yeah,
Mm,
mm,
fun times.
yeah. I guess that's one of the cool things about FPS. Yeah, especially the multiplayer ones. You can just pick up and play,
Yeah,
and then leave it again. Like
yeah.
it's
Mm.
that it doesn't really require super much investment in you to like learn how to play an FPS, unless
And
you want to get really, really good, I guess.
it's different, isn't it? You don't have to follow certain stories, as you said, especially with the multiplayer one.
We make first-person shooters sound a lot like Mario Kart right now. But yes, you're right. There's no investment needed from the player. Like I have no responsibility to like pay attention to a narrative right now, like
Yeah,
the plot lines.
other than headshot.
Yes. Monster kill.
Monster kill. So let's delve into it. Let's delve into first person shooter games.
Yes.
The term first person shooter is relatively new, originating in the mid to late 90s. Before this time, they would often be referred to simply as action or shooter games, so they didn't really have this like FPS banner on them.
Yeah, no. Also, they had a lot of 2D games, right? And
Mm,
then it's like they just kind of get put in that kind of cupboard, right? Of like, it's just you shoot some stuff. Yeah, and
yes.
that's all.
So this was until the huge success of Doom, released in 1993, and for a few years, FPS games largely imitated the game's core design elements of Doom, basically, and were known as Doom clones.
Yeah, and this was for quite a while. I think a couple of years. And you know what? I don't want to go on too long of a tangent here, but it's super a pet peeve of mine in the gaming industry. That happens a fair bit. So like I
Yeah,
remember for a long time, any game that was similar to GTA was called a GTA clone.
yeah,
Before finally we moved on and we called it, like sandbox style
Sandbox,
or like
yeah.
free roam. But then like I really enjoyed a game called True Crime, and that was just always stamped off as being a GTA clone. We still do it now. We got like Souls
Souls
like,
like, oh my god,
yeah.
yes.
And when will we finally get over that? calling it like a Souls like? Can we
Mm,
not just call it something that it is? Because I always feel like everyone's always been inspired by something that came previous.
mhm.
Even though they are massively successful and innovate and develop the genre, you can't always make like a single developer um, give them all the credit basically for an entire genre. It doesn't work that way. And with FPS, we'll find out that's exactly the same here too. Yeah.
Yeah, and once games progressed and developed beyond Doom's offerings, this old Doom clones saga basically, the term FPS started being used. Most players seems to agree that this was around the time of Duke Nukem 3D and Quake, which were both released in 1996. So actually, as you said before, the history of FPS runs deeper than the games made by id Software.
Yeah, like Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, it goes back, like way back into time.
Yeah, well, you know what? No doubt that those games were massive milestones and amongst the most influential games of all time that are basically genre definer. We need to look into the definition and characteristic of FPS to see how deep this rabbit hole goes.
Let's do it, Alice.
So let's start with the basics. An FPS is played through the eyes of a character and involves shooting long range weapons.
Yeah, no nonsense, straightforward. That's all we get. This is the definition.
Yeah, and in this episode, we won't be including games in which the player only control a vehicle, like a spaceship, plane, or a tank, in a first person point of view. It's definitely up for debate if they should be included. Strictly speaking, we would agree to that, but we're trying to keep this episode a little bit more bite sized than what already is quite a mammoth episode.
I know. I absolutely love these types of episodes, like adventure games, point and click with it this way, but like there's so much research, there's so much to uncover. We
Yes,
we have to keep it a little bit down by just focusing on you're using a human to move around. It's just gonna make
exactly.
it a little bit easier and straightforward.
I think if we talk about all the types of games that are available within certain genre, our entire podcast can literally be just about that.
Yeah, Gaming History Club now just becomes click click bang bang.
Yeah, exactly. A defining feature too is that the controlled character can be moved freely by the player, as otherwise the game would fall into a different category again, which is shooting gallery or rail shooter. Again, that's a different thing. That's not a first person shooter.
No.
Let's also point out, because we're talking about first person and our eyes see things in 3D, the games will at least have the illusion of depth, although using 2D trickery.
Yes. So, as we can tell, player one, it's actually really difficult when we look at the definition for an FPS, because it's actually incredibly broad, and sometimes it's hard to tell whether we should actually categorize something as an FPS or not. And this has been true for the entire history of video games, not just nowadays. Nowadays, it's also still very difficult. Um, but at least we won't have to wrestle with this too much because we've pinned it down a little bit.
Yeah,
Of course, with better technology and more games being released to draw inspiration from, FPSs have continually expanded their horizons and they've incorporated many elements from different game genres as well. But we will get into that as we go along into our timeline, because this is actually one of the most interesting things to look at with FPSs, of course.
yeah, that's true. So let's get into our first FPS game,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
if you're thinking about, oh, what was the first FPS game? People will most likely answer things like Wolfenstein or Doom, but actually, no,
No.
it's not, right? The first FPS game is actually also the first 3D game ever made. You might remember this from our 2D to 3D episode. So, the game is Maze War, or simply known as Maze. Maze was developed back in 1973 by high school students trio Steve Colley, Greg Thompson, and Howard Palmer. They developed the game on an AMLAC PDS-1 mini computer, which was not mini at all, by the way. It's humongous.
We did this joke last time.
Sorry, but I cannot help myself. I hate that they call it mini computer. It ain't.
It's just like a note, just in case you're wondering, mini computer, you're not down with like the computer tech history. These mini computers were absolutely huge, probably bigger than your bedroom a lot of the time.
Exactly. And yeah, so Steve, Greg, and Howard developed this during school study program at NASA Ames Research Center. Super mega interesting details we're going to leave out here because we've already covered much of May's creation backstory back in the 2D to 3D episode. So we'll skip straight into the actual game. What started as a technical showcase for the player to navigate a 3D vector maze, the simplicity soon became boring.
Yeah, so you can imagine a game like this. You, as the player, you could move only one tile at a time, looking down a corridor, and the corridor is made up just out of 2D vector lines, just like, pretending something is 3D when you draw on a piece of paper. And they would represent walls, but there was no looking or aiming as such. You can only move in 90 degrees angle. So if you want to turn right, you go like right, and then going right again, you look behind you. So it was very stuck, and you could only move one tile at a time. Although there was a little bit of an animation going from one tile to another. But the game very, very quickly expanded from here just because it was a little bit boring, to be quite honest. So, multiplayer was amongst the first things they've added, and other players would actually appear on the other player's screen and it would just show up as an eyeball. And if you've not guessed it so far, what would come naturally next if you want to spruce the game up a little bit? Well, yes, of course. Let us shoot these other player eyeballs. And that's exactly what happened. So, if you think Wolfenstein 3D and Doom were revolutionary, well, get this. By 1976, Maze had an in game map, it had AI enemies with different skill levels, it had a level editor, you had the ability to peek around corners, and you had a separate screen that could be set up just for spectators to watch the game happening for the actual players.
Wow.
Yeah, live gameplay watching. And all of these things had never been done before. It was truly exciting time to be alive. And it is no wonder that rumor has it that half the network traffic between MIT and Stanford on the ARPANET, which is where the players played against each other, on the internet's precursor basically, was rumored to be students playing against each other. Half the entire network, it was just students playing against each other. Never mind all that research. Maybe they had a similar they must have had a similar teacher to you, I guess, back in the day,
Yeah,
Gabby.
just chill. Yeah, go play. All good. No, but I think they did actually play until like the middle of the night kind of deal.
Yeah, yeah. They were our forebearers. We took the torch from these guys. And if you're wondering, by the way, yes, students found a way to hack and cheat in the game. Humans are so predictable.
Always.
Yeah. We'll leave a link in the source if you want to check out a YouTube video of Maze. Super, super interesting.
So the timeline for true FPS gets quickly messy at this point. Mace received its own share of so called clones and true sequels, and for a time, these were the only ones in which the player controlled a character and sometimes shot things or fled away from enemies. But there were games being made that pushed gameplay and technology in a direction that would help evolving the genre of FPS itself. Games like Battlezone from 1980 offered free horizontal aiming and forward and back movement. So that's already like one step ahead from Maze because it's breaking away from the grid like 90 degrees movement. But unfortunately, you played as a tank instead of a character, so we're not going to delve into that, although it's still really worth the mention for this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Because otherwise, we might give player one the idea that like the FPSs did all of the innovation here. But no, there was games that give FPS that tech that they would
Yes.
adapt to make their own games properly. Yeah. Mm.
So, other than Battlezone, there were also first person RPGs in which you do control a character, but you didn't shoot as such. For example, Akalabeth, World of Doom, and also Dungeons of Daggorath. Here, the games were command based with hotkeys and more related to RPGs, so not really shooting, but more into your exploring.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. Instead of just eyeballs, you do have like actual enemies
Hmm.
on screen, but it is very much you're typing in almost like a text-based adventure game. Like it's more like
Attack, I
attack with
guess.
axe,
Mm.
stab or swing. So it's not really like FPS. There's no shooting.
That's true,
Mm.
and also it's still chance based, so that's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons style
Yeah,
of
100%. And
mm,
if we did like a history of RPG, for example, it would much more align with that episode than it would an FPS. But it's just to give you player one an idea of what is actually happening outside of FPSs that
mhm.
were building the genre in the background, so to say. The next real big step for FPSs, though, was Phantom Slayer, which was released for the TRS 80 in 1982 and developed by Med Systems. So, in Phantom Slayer, you must navigate a random generated level and shoot all of the phantoms, and then the next level would load, and that would be at a higher difficulty. So, it's very, very similar to Maze War, but now graphically, there's been some progress being made though from just the vector lines. So it's either all black and white or black and green. Now we've actually got some solid block colors. We can see our projectile move towards the enemy phantoms that you need to shoot. And just in general, it's I guess it's a similar pace really, but it's a little bit more immersive. There's a little bit more going on. It's not quite so quote unquote basic. Not saying Maze was basic, but we see the graphics improve a little bit now too.
Yeah, from vector lines to RGB color block. Literally, like when you think about RGB color, red, green, blue, code color,
Yeah,
that's
definitely.
definitely that they.
It's almost like for Maze, they were using paint, right? And
Yeah,
they could only draw straight lines,
yeah.
right? But then for Phantom Slayer,
You can color inside
yeah,
it.
they discovered the bucket tool. Yeah, this is what
Yeah,
happened. That's
that's
exactly what happened historically speaking. This is a historical fact, by the way, guys.
no, it's not. Right. So move on to the next one. We're gonna talk about Way Out. So that's a game from 1982. It was developed and published by Sirius Software and released for the Apple II, Atari 8-bit, and Commodore 64 computers. The reason we're highlighting this game is that while it isn't a shooter, it broke the grid like 90 degrees of movement for maze like games. So you are still in a maze, you don't shoot anyone, but finally you can move around.
Yeah, we're now finally able to see some fluidity.
Yeah,
When we like, it feels more animated when you walk through like things. You're actually like progressing through the level. It's not just like you stand, you close your eyes, you take a step forward, you open your eyes. It's not like that anymore,
yeah.
and it's also not the 90 degrees movement. It's all a lot more fluid. That's the best way I can describe it, really.
Yeah, it is definitely a lot more fluid. So it used ray casting technology. A method simulates a 3D environment by casting rays from the player's viewpoint into the 2D map to render its environment. Basically, for all intents and purposes, it looks and it feels like Doom, but with much lower resolution and kind of lack of texture. But the point is, it is not a shooter, but you can move around like you can in Doom. So in Way Out, the game required you to find the exit to a maze, while an enemy had the ability to steal your compass and map. There was also a wind mechanic that could blow you away and sometimes be too strong to overcome, making it a bit more difficult for you to navigate around this maze.
Yes, the game could blow you away.
Yeah,
It was so good.
I know. Figuratively and literally, apparently, within the game. So, Way Out's sequel released the following year called Capture the Flag, and it serves as one of the earliest multiplayer games from a first person perspective within a 3D rendered environment that allowed full 360 degrees of movement. That's a lot of criteria to make it to that first category, but there you have it. Way out and capture the flag.
Well, it was one of the first. I mean, this sounds a lot like Space Sim, if you ask me as
Oh,
well.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
true.
But yeah, in terms of the FPS, in that essence, yeah, I guess absolutely, yeah, capture the flag. Mm. Uh, the next interesting game is actually gonna take us a few years to get to. So now we are in 1987, but here we see two actually really big titles that helped to make FPS what they are today. The first is going to be Meaty Maze, which was released for the Atari ST, and it was developed by Xamph Software FX. So Meaty Maze actually combined the core gameplay elements from the original Maze with the multiplayer shooting, but it combined it with the technological improvements made with the games like Way Out and Capture the Flag. So this one definitely counts as an FPS. The game allowed full freedom of movement and it animates smoothly. And you also have shooting. So no 90 degrees angle tile by tile stuff. And we shoot, shoot, shoot. And the really interesting thing with MIDI Maze is actually if you take the Atari ST and you daisy chain the MIDI ports together, you could actually have up to 16 people play on this game, shooting each other's 3D smiley emoji looking characters. That's basically what they look like. Yeah, floating heads, floating smiley heads. So by introducing this whole new mechanic of daisy chaining your computers together, the game actually introduced deathmatch FPS to the world, and it did so way before LAN parties were ever a thing. It was way earlier than that. And I would like to say it completely revolutionized FPS in this way. It was fast, it was fun, there was color, and it was just really fun to play. So yeah, Media Maze, definitely a really cool one here in this timeline. Although I must probably say that I did prefer the other game that came out in 1987. So the second milestone game to come out this year was The Colony, and that's an FPS developed by David Allen Smith and published by Mindscape. So while games around this time of 1987 were mostly using pre-rendered views, The Colony allowed free movement in a 3D space rendered in real time. So it was really interesting how David actually achieved this with the hardware available to him at the time. The game world used 256 degrees rather than 360 degrees to make a full circle. And this allowed the game to better make use of the hardware by conforming to that binary nature that the computers are built on, right? So when the player turns just 1 degree at a time, the game engine needed only a single byte to change the perspective of the player.
Mm.
And yeah, this is obviously a massive deal because with the hardware available, we're still very much, processing power, memory, like we still need to make full advantage of every single little thing available to us to come up with impressive graphics. And this game did really have some impressive graphics, let me tell you. While most of the other FPSs we've talked about, they don't have any objects in the game world, right? It's all just you're in this pseudo 3D environment, and there's like walls, and there's a ceiling, and there's a floor. But this game had actual objects in the game. You had like bathtubs in the game, for example. You had enemies in the game, sinks, light switches, airlocks, and they would stick out from the environment as they would in real life. They weren't just painted onto walls, for example. It just looks really, really, really pretty. And we will also leave a link in the source for David Allen Smith himself giving a behind the scenes on YouTube of some really interesting background stuff about this game. It's really mind blowing though. Like when I did my research, obviously I travel through this timeline, right? And then when you see this game, all of a sudden you're like, wow, where did this come from? Very impressive, the colony, honestly.
Yeah, and it's also impressive that you can actually interact with these objects inside the games. And yeah, like flushing the toilet, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and before I forget, I should also mention this was a game where aiming with the mouse was the way to do it. Before that, the mouse for a computer was still like an optional peripheral, but in the game, yeah, that mouse was your way of aiming, and that was like also like a really early thing to do for an FPS.
But of course, we couldn't talk about the history of first person shooter games without talking about the games made by its software and also talk about their founders, the programming geniuses, John Carmack and John Romero, game designer Tom Hall, and artist Adrian Carmack. By the way, Adrian Carmack is not related to John Carmack. They're not brothers or anything. They just happen to have the same last name. Am I right?
Yes, unless of course it's an inside joke by these brothers. Who knows, yeah.
Oh my god. Imagine. But its software didn't magic Wolfenstein 3D and Doom out of thin air. So, John Carmack wanted to move away from family friendly 2D games, and his goal was to combine the slow first person 3D action of flight simulators, but make them fast, radical, and catering towards an adult audience, just like many of the games you see in the arcade during that time. Because to be fair, home computers simply weren't up to the task for fast paced 3D action games like those dedicated machines in the arcade. Even for like something we think of as quite straightforward, like smooth scrolling on IBM PCs, it was difficult to achieve without some coding trickery. But John Carmack figured out a method to enable rapid side scrolling graphics on PC. So he and the game designer Tom Hall actually replicated the entire first level of Mario Bros. 3 on PC to test their working method of enabling side scrolling 2D games. Geniuses?
Really interesting little bit of trivia there, yeah. Mm.
Definitely. More importantly, though, John Carmack took the idea of raycasting from other games like Way Out and Capture the Flag we mentioned earlier and built his own game engine that could deliver better, faster result. So his engine was able to render 3D images just as fast as rendering 2D. The computer would only draw what the player could see instead of an entire game world, making the rendering speeds much faster.
Finally, he achieved his goal, getting fast paced action on the PC.
Yeah, 100%. So its first FPS was called Hover Tank 1 that was released in April 1991. So not the ones that you think about when you heard about its software.
No, no, this is not Wolfenstein yet. Oh, no, we're still a little while away from Wolfenstein 3D here. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's true. So in this game, Hover Tank 1, we can walk about freely, yet graphically, all the walls and floors are just solid block colors. It's not exactly pretty game to be honest. It's cool, don't get me wrong, but it's not the prettiest one.
No, it's not any worse than what has come before, definitely. But I think on a positive note, it has definitely got like fast.
Yeah.
Mm.
So you as the player control the mercenary Brick Sledge, who's tasked with rescuing people from mutated humans. Some of those mutated humans look very similar to the pinky enemies in Doom, by the way, which, wouldn't be released for a few years yet, just to make a note there. But already we see a disposition from it to give their FPS main characters very eye rolling masculine action names. Brick Sledge.
I am very much rolling my eyes right now. Yes, there's a trend being set here, and it is very eye rolling indeed.
A little bit, yeah, I must agree with you. Unfortunately, though, Hover Tank wasn't a big success. The game lacked prettiness, and gameplay was quite repetitive. Still, it was a step in the right direction, and it would continue to develop and build upon their FPS formula, starting from Hover Tank.
So John Carmack would further refine his game engine, and he was actually taking inspiration from a game that was at the time still in development by Looking Glass Studios, and it was actually Ultima Underworld, a really big first-person RPG. So John Carmack actually incorporated a way of mapping textures onto surfaces in the game, and that would really help him put some flourish into his game engine, no longer the boring solid block colors, right?
Thank God.
I know. So, using this technique, they released their next and still somewhat unknown FPS, Catacomb 3D, in November of 1991, just half a year after Hover Tank, actually. And Wow, they really are like releasing these games like really, really quickly right now, right? So using this new technique now, walls had brick shapes in them you could see. They had moss running from them. It just looked overall a lot more polished and realistic. I mean, it doesn't sound like the world now, but if you imagine like solid color and then like textures on there, it makes a massive difference, of course, in game.
Yeah.
And it really helped the game look a lot better than Hover Tank. Also, a lot of hallmark staples of the games to come would actually take place here first in Catacomb 3D. So, for example, a cartoon head that was representing the health of your character,
Mhm.
and a hand that appears when shooting. Those things all came from Catacomb 3D first, which is really cool because now finally we can see our own in game bodies during our first person experience. So
Yeah.
that's also a first here. Unfortunately, the game still failed to make a big impression, however. Maybe it was a lack of weapons, since you could only shoot magic fireballs in Catacomb 3D, but their next game would be a massive success and forever help shape and popularize FPS in the mainstream gaming market. So, Player One, finally, we arrive at our probably big, massive, huge milestone game, Wolfenstein 3D, considered one of the most influential video games made of all time, released in May 1992. And compared to what came before, it was fast, it was violent, and on a purely technical level, it was graphically very intense, and it was showcasing just how much a PC could actually do when programmed correctly. So, player one, in case you snoozed over Wolfenstein 3D, in the game you play as the Allied spy William B.J. Blazkowicz. He infiltrates the World War II bunkers in the game and blasts through Nazi enemies, and sadly dogs as well, and other enemies. The player could find several different weapons, including pistols, submachine guns, a chain gun, and a knife. There was also a finite amount of ammunition available, so you'd have to go along and pick that up as you move through the levels. There were secret areas that could be found, keys that needed collecting, and an epic endgame boss fight with Mecha Hitler. So, I mean, compared to everything that came before this, yes, we can actually see why Wolfenstein 3D was a massive thing. It has loads of that classic video game formula sprinkled in all over. Several different weapons, boss fights, secret areas. This is the magic sauce that all good games have, isn't it, really? Right? Especially back in those classy days. The game also allowed you to save at any point, and there was a points based system too at the end of each level that would measure your performance based on the amount of enemies that you killed, among other things, and how quickly the player actually finished the level to really cement the fact that this game was meant to be played action style. Although the points based system wasn't first introduced in Wolfenstein 3D, that's actually from Hover Tank already.
Yeah, I believe in Hovertank you're also being judged by how many people you manage to save and enemies you manage to kill and the time as well. So yeah, all of those elements already started from even their first game.
Yeah, that's true. And it's very easy to actually get stuck here as well in the legacy of Wolfenstein 3D, just because it is as influential as it actually is. So we need to keep moving a little bit. So we're not going to go too much in detail about Wolfenstein 3D, but let's just see some of what else came out of this game. One of the things that really helped Wolfenstein 3D blow up so quickly in popularity was the way that they actually released the game to the public too. So the game was actually released partially as shareware, so you could actually play the initial levels completely for free and anyone could try it out. And if you wanted the full game, then its publisher Apogee would send you the other mail order levels in the post.
Ah.
By the time it released their source code for free in 1995, which that's pretty cool move by the way, guys. The game sold over 250,000 copies, which is extremely well for games at the time on the computer. And yes, though the game is violent, it's bloody, and it's action oriented, obviously we have to keep in mind this was a conscious design decision in order to bring a fast paced, primal, action oriented first person shooter onto the PCs. It was meant to be fast, it was meant to be cool, It was meant to really give you that arcade vibe for your computer. So obviously, it is going to be kind of like what we got in Wolfenstein 3D, right? And I just want to mention that because it seems easy to look back on it now and look at it a little bit like, okay, yeah, but it was the entire point. The PC did not have a game like that, and they made it, and it was fast. Something which just wasn't done like that before.
Yeah, and also intended for adult audience, really, with all of those violent, bloody, and action oriented.
Yeah, and it wasn't just popular with mainstream gamers. Even the Game Developers Conference noted the game for being one of the top games of the year in 1993. And of course, we shouldn't gloss over the immersive music and sound effects made by Bobby Prince, which really gave it that cherry on top of the Wolfenstein cake.
Yeah, Wolfenstein is an amazing game. I'm not gonna lie. While most people in its software were working to releasing add-ons, more episodes, random level generator, a release of over 800 fan-made levels and a map editor, John Carmack in the background was already researching into improving his 3D engine, and the team at id Software were excited to plan their next game. So, the decision to make their game even darker didn't come from simply doubling down on Wolfenstein's theme. Apparently, the team was inspired by a Dungeons and Dragons campaign that the team was playing and actually using technology in order to fight demons. So, you're not using your magic anymore, but use technology like laser or guns.
Yeah, something not really done in games that much. Yeah, it's either fantasy or it's like sci-fi. But
Yeah,
how often do you really use a laser to fight a ghost? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and
Hmm.
this is back in the 90s, so early 90s, I might add. So, yeah, impressive. So, during this time, its software parted ways with their publisher Apogee, believing that they outgrew them and could be more financially successful with publishing future games themselves. But it won't be the last we hear from Apogee in this episode. So, yeah, at this time, they also moved office to a dimly lit workspace with sounds that could be overheard from a neighboring dentist, and they aptly named it Suite 666. For all I care, they could have called this Dungeon 666.
Yeah, Dungeon 666, Dark Cave, Claustrophobia,
666.
Mania. Yeah.
Still with the triple six. But yeah. Anyway, but here in the Suite 666, the game Doom was born. Doom was released in December 1993, and it's crazy to think that this game, too, though on paper really similar to Wolfenstein 3D, would also become one of the most influential and arguably best games ever made. This game changed almost everything about PC games, from the continuing development of graphics in 3D first person games, online multiplayer, a founding pillar in speedrunning, a substantial modding community, also criticism of mature game contents, so all of that. So in Doom, the superior game engine was even faster, and it could display walls and floors at any angle or height that give way to falling ceilings, revealing deadly spikes or enemies. They also have advanced lighting techniques allowed for enemies hidden in the shadows, strobe effects, and in general improved realism in the game, like making faraway enemies looking darker. Movable switches and stairs were also becoming a thing now. You can play the main campaign of Doom in 5 different difficulty settings. The first one is I'm Too Young to Die, which is very easy. Second one is Hey, Not Too Rough, which is easy. The third one is Hurt Me Plenty, which is the normal difficulty level. The next one is Ultra Violence, which is the equivalent of hard mode. And the last one is Nightmare! Exclamation mark. That's a challenge mode. In this one, enemies will respawn and basically nearly impossible in Doom 2. So, knowing the model was actually working really well in Wolfenstein 3D, in Doom, the game was built with fan made creation in mind. Doom's graphics and level data were housed WAD files WAD, so that stands for Where's All the Data? So players of the more technical flavor could easily modify the game themselves. It doesn't have to come from the developer. If you wanted to play Doom on your calculator, that's absolutely fine and you can make that happen.
Yes, or on your smart fridge, any type of device really.
Honestly, it's almost everywhere.
It is everywhere.
So
Like,
it's like if you buy a piece of tech, you're kind of asking yourself, but can it play Doom?
yeah, but can it play Doom?
Yeah. So while Doom is not the first game to have a deathmatch mode, it coined the term and allowed for competitive online multiplayer, but also online co op for the main campaign. It's easy to get lost in how revolutionary and important Doom was in the history of gaming, especially when you consider most games during that time were 2D and looked a lot more like Super Mario, Street Fighter, Zelda, Sonic, and SimCity 2000. Compared to Doom, Doom is very mature, fast paced, and first person. But let's point out some key things Doom did not have to better keep on track with the evolution and timeline of FPS games. There was no aiming up or down, no jumping, or slopes in the game world's geometry. It also didn't have much in terms of a story. It kind of did, I guess, but it might as well not have existed, to be quite frank.
Building on the success of Doom, many game developers now try to imitate the game's fast paced and gory FPS formula. And before the term FPS was born, these games were simply known as Doom clones. They weren't as popular or successful, though there were attempts to innovate and build upon the genre anyway. An early example was System Shock, released in 1994, providing more immersion and plot than Doom did, with cerebral, thought provoking topics including philosophy, rogue AI, the nature of humanity, and cybernetics. Let's have a look at some more noteworthy Doom clones actually, because it is not fair to just pin them off as being Doom clones. They were doing stuff, right? First, let's have a look at Heretic, released in December 94 and developed by Raven Software, with the assistance and publishing of id Software though to help them along. John Carmack, having been impressed with Raven Software's previous games, requested the D&D obsessed team at Raven make a game like Doom, using the Doom engine, but to add more fantasy elements to the game rather than technology versus demons, just have like a more fantasy game. And the game added interactive environments and inventory items to use whenever the player wanted to, rather than just like a pick up and go. It was like, oh, you can add this and then use it later if you want to. One of them even turned your enemies into chickens.
Amazing.
Yeah, and this game would also be an early example of actual first person shooters, adding elements of role playing games into them as well. The game also allowed the player to look up and down, as well as fly, as a matter of fact, but still being bound to the confines of the Doom engine, the effect would actually skew the perspective somewhat with stretching pixels. So that's the only way the Doom engine could actually have you look up or down. It would stretch those pixels rather than render it with the raycasting. Another really, really cool game, which would have been called a Doom clone back in the day, was Star Wars Dark Forces. And this one is really interesting because it was actually inspired by a mod made for Doom. So, one of the things that the Doom modding community did was actually put the Death Star in the game, which that totally makes sense to me. Of course, someone would come up with that, right?
Yeah,
So, Star Wars Dark Forces released in March 1995 and it was developed and published by LucasArts using their own Jedi game engine. The game did allow you to look up and down, but also to jump and crouch. The game also featured more advanced game world atmosphere effects like animated textures, fog, shading, and it was just praised all around for being a really active environment with spaceships flying around in the background, for example. It was just really moody, actually. The game also made a real attempt now to include a plot into a FPS. The game engine was able to produce fully 3D objects, but not enemies. That would come much later. So, rendering absolutely everything in 3D was still very difficult for a computer to handle, but it wouldn't be too far until we get fully 3D rendered games. It wasn't too much longer to go.
So you might remember Apogee, its software's former publisher that published its first few games. Now they're called 3D Realms. And apparently they also made a Doom clone, a real controversial badass Doom clone at that. In January 1996, they released Duke Nukem 3D, a sequel to their previously 2D side scrolling shooters. Duke Nukem 3D stands out for developing the protagonist in a way that gives him an actual personality and a voice, with wisecracking macho one liners like,
You're an inspiration for birth control.
and
Looks like a cleanup on aisle 4.
oh god. But yeah, heavily inspired by stereotypical action movies heroes, we can't help but love it for its stupidity. Although, I'm not gonna lie, it was definitely incredibly sexist and misogynistic as well. And we don't support that.
No, we don't. But it is a parody, so I don't feel too bad about getting a chuckle out of it. It's
Yeah,
okay. It's supposed to be stupid, I guess, but can't see this kind of game flying these days, can you?
probably not.
No.
But you know what? It was the central theme of the plot and focus of the game in general, anyway, for Duke Nukem. To give it credit where credit is due, though, Duke Nukem 3D allowed interactive elements as well, like light switches, toilets, and apparently dancing strippers.
Hmm. So these were some games that we feel like definitely are worthy of more than just being labeled a Doom clone. But it was probably id Software's own game that put the nail in the coffin for the term. And we finally provide these games with a title that this episode is dedicated to after all. Id Software released Quake in June 1996 and yet somehow, again, completely revolutionizes the first person shooter genre. For Quake, the game used a brand new engine, and it was yet another massive technical leap. Gone were pre rendered lighting and 2D enemies. Our light was dynamic and real time, and we had 3D polygonal enemies, a first for the genre. If we could count FPSs in which you play as a character only, though, rather than a vehicle, because otherwise the crown actually goes to The Descent from 1 year prior in 1995, but you don't play as a human character, so we're not including that one. Yeah. Quake supported 3D accelerated graphics cards, which was still brand new territory for tech at that time. And though it wasn't the first person shooter to use the mouse as the default way of aiming, Quake made it a standard forever that FPSs were going to use a mouse to aim and shoot. Now with fully 3D environments, and we should really stress this fact here as it's completely pivotal to the history of FPSs, Player One. It is fully 3D in the truest sense of the word. And it took complete advantage of this too by allowing players to rocket jump by aiming the missiles directly at the floor and providing for a nice little boost from the explosion. A lot of fun. Quake also introduced new multiplayer modes. So gone were like the classic deathmatch and co-op campaign modes from Doom. Now you also had the team-based modes as well. And Quake saw really big numbers of players competing online as well, relatively to 1996 internet and LAN parties, of course. But still, for the time, absolutely huge. And it's acknowledged for being one of the first to do so on a big scale and providing a precursor and foundation that esports would eventually be built on online as well. Of course, id Software is also known for always giving us some of like the best music and audio in games, and they didn't fail with Quake either by having Trent Reznor and his band Nine Inch Nails providing a killer soundtrack to Rocket Jump 2 as well. Now it made no more sense to call these types of games just Doom clones, since id Software themselves made something even better than this, right? Now it was gone. First person shooters are born, and finally, we now find out how FPS, as a word at least, came around.
Wow, it took a long time.
Yes, it did take a long time, yeah. Maze from 1973 and 20 plus years later, finally, we give it FPS a term.
I know, yeah. Luckily, it's not called Mace Clones anymore at this point.
Oh, that would be really embarrassing.
I know. But yeah, following Quake, now we're in the late 90s. FPS are quickly gaining popularity and truly expanding their scope. We've been focusing heavily on games released on computer, and for good reason as well. Key milestone games all released on mainframe computers, and then home computers, and then PC. But when GoldenEye, developed by Rare and released in 1997 exclusively for the Nintendo 64, it proved that FPS could also be successful on home consoles. It did so in a big way too. Despite the low expectations for an FPS being controlled with a gamepad, it became yet another FPS holding the title for one of the best games ever made.
I'm getting sick of saying that in this episode. One of the best games ever made. But you know what? It's great because it really comes to show that when we mentioned that FPSs are like the flagship genre of video games, yeah, we get an understanding of why some of what people would consider the most influential, some of the greatest games ever made, so many of them are actually FPS games.
Yeah, it only proved the point further.
Yeah,
So yeah, with GoldenEye taking inspiration from light gun shooter Virtua Cop, enemies would react differently depending on where you shot them, making that fatal crotch shot during multiplayer the ultimate form of humiliation.
it certainly did.
So moving on to 1998, Epic releases Unreal, built on its own engine, which would have a life all on its own to this very day. I mean, who hasn't heard of Unreal Engine?
Yes, Unreal Engine 5, especially the demos these days. Ooh,
My god, they look really pretty.
so pretty.
And yeah, of course, we couldn't talk about the late 90s without mentioning Half Life, also released in 1998 by Valve. So, Valve felt that FPS weren't innovative enough. So, they got help from a science fiction writer, Mark Laidlaw, to create this cinematic experience with in game scripted cutscenes, basically just making the world feel more alive for the players and immersing the player into a genuine, terrifying, and exciting story that unfolds as you play the game. So, Half Life gave rise to extremely popular mods. Among them, of course, Counter Strike, which added a more sensible, tactical approach to multiplayer. It introduced multiplayer modes where the goal for the team was to do more than just shoot the other team. For example, rescuing hostages, where terrorists held NPCs hostage that the counter terrorists would need to lead to a safe point. Or another mode where terrorists plant a bomb in one of several locations that the counter terrorist would have to find and disarm.
So cool, right? I mean, it's not the first time we had like game modes where it was more team based,
Yeah,
but this felt like real objectives. You know, you had to rescue hostages, you had to disarm a bomb. It wasn't go get that flag and then put it in your base.
yeah, it's a bit more tactical.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, yeah.
But what really made it tactical though is that the game was played in rounds, so that if you died, you wouldn't be able to support your team for the remainder of the round. You can just be a silent watcher, basically.
Spectator.
Yes, until your team has either won or lost, then you can jump back in and play another round. This made for a much more calculated and careful approach to multiplayer gaming. Definitely a far cry from the rocket jumping maniac gameplay style of Quake or Doom.
If you wanted your FPS to stand out and become successful, it was now becoming very obvious what the formula needs to be. You had to add something new and worthwhile with more substance than just running around and shooting people. This became very obvious during the late 90s now. Thief the Dark Project, for example, released in '98 and developed by Looking Glass Studios, it incorporated a brand new concept to first person games. It incorporated stealth mechanics, something which in general was only being done very rarely in games until now anyway, but definitely a first for FPS. And this game actually had an influence on non FPS games as well, like Splinter Cell and Hitman. And to further hit home this point, let's end the 90s appropriately and mention Deus Ex. Released in June 2000 and developed by Ironstorm, this game incorporated stealth, adventure, and RPG elements into a unique gameplay experience that provided the player choice with how to complete his objectives. In order to complete your objective, it was up to you how you were going to do it. So you can talk your way through a security guard, sneak your way in through the roof, lockpick the door, hack the keycard reader, or just shoot your way in. The game allowed you to play the way you wanted and invest your skill points in mechanics that you enjoyed the most in the game. It had a really moody, atmospheric vibe set in a cyberpunk dystopia and a large conspiracy to unravel as well. So now that we're in the 2000s and beyond, let's start wrapping up this episode a little bit because we just wanted to concentrate on how first person shooters became first person shooters. And I think at this point, we've really done it some justice now already too. And let's be fair here, there's simply too many games to talk about because many of them are like so unique and special and massively successful. They could all warrant their own dedicated episodes as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, let's just mention a few, I think, just to wrap it up nicely. So I think Halo, of course, would be one that's worth mentioning because if GoldenEye was the first one to kind of prove that, like, hey, consoles can also have really good FPSs,
Mm.
then Halo really also cemented that fact again, like it can be fun on the Xbox, right? Um, I guess we have to mention Call of Honor and Medal of Duty, if you know what I mean.
Wait, what?
Yeah, not a big fan. Neither of us are we, really, if we're being
No,
honest.
I mean, we have
Mm.
to be fair though. There's still big games that made it that people are looking forward to year on year. Probably not us, but we need to give credit where credit's due.
Definitely give credit where credit is due. You're absolutely right. Of course, some of my own personal favorites, well, our personal favorites, if you don't want to, you don't have to shoot at all. Yet there's still first person shooters, maybe at a stretch. Mirror's Edge, for example, absolutely huge fan of Mirror's Edge.
That's FPP, first person parkour game.
It is first person parkour game, but you can pick up a gun and shoot it sometimes
Very true.
if you
Yeah.
really want to.
Even on the tutorial, you're being taught to do that. So, yep.
And our probably personal most favorite FPS of all time, Cyberpunk 2077.
Yeah, which is more RPG slash FPS kind of game.
Yeah, like I mean, you do have to shoot, but you could play like a, like a good guy, quote unquote. Like maybe kill as few people as possible, hack them instead, knock them out unconscious.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just gives you very similar to Deus Ex actually, like so many options
Yeah,
how to
that's
play.
true.
Yeah. Super interesting will also be where the future takes us, of course, with VR, if that actually ever does become the mainstream way of consuming your video games,
Mm.
like instead of home console. Because if it does, I am 100% certain that FPSs will be the most popular game genre to consume with a virtual headset, without a doubt.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
So, thank you for joining us, Player One. We hope you enjoyed Click Click Bang Bang. We hope you learned something new about this often underrated and easily discarded as brainless genre, without which video games just wouldn't be the same.
Yeah, and what about you, Player One? What's your favorite FPS? Share with us and drop us a message on our website, gaminghistory.club. New episode of Gaming History Club are released every other Wednesday, so make sure you subscribe and follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Gaming History Club.
Come back in a couple of weeks, Player One, when we celebrate Halloween a week early with our very first Game Lore episode. See ya.